warm welcome to the 15th edition of Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India at Darbar Hall. The festival brochure and flyer for all the program is available at the information desk. We are delighted to introduce Diving for Pearls. This session is presented by Culture Ireland and Embassy of Ireland. Irish writer Jamie O'Connell's debut novel, Diving for Pearls, examines 7 lives that intertwine with the discovery of a dead body in Dubai Marina. A deep take into the fragility of the capitalist world, the narratives crisply shine a light on each character and the turmoils they face. In conversation with Manasi Subramaniam, executive editor at Penguin Press India, O'Connell discusses his vibrant and complex tale of human greed, aspiration, and inequality. Jamie O'Connell's debut novel was published in June 2021. He was highly commended for the Costa Short Story Award 2018, shortlisted for Maeve Binchy Travel Award and Sky Arts Future Fund, and longlisted for BBC Radio 4 Opening Lines Short Story Competition. Manasi Subramaniam is Associate Publisher and Head of Rights at Penguin Random House. Over to Manasi.
Thank you. So, hello everyone, welcome to this session. This is the book that we're going to be discussing. It's available at the bookshop, so I hope you all pick up a copy. As you've heard just now, this is, it's a book that begins with a dead body that's found in the Dubai Marina. I don't want to give too much away, but through the course of the novel, we meet some very interesting characters and learn more about the death from their perspectives. But Jamie, the thing that I found most fascinating is you've marked out 7 key characters in the novel, but the city of Dubai itself is like a living, breathing creature. You take us bang into the marina, we soon see the Burj Khalifa. The city has a personality of its own almost. And I want to start by asking you, how did your fascination with Dubai begin?
Well, I first visited Dubai in about 2010. A lot of Irish people had moved to Dubai around that time because there was such an economic crash, obviously happened worldwide in 2008. And a lot of people around my age who had been recently graduated couldn't find opportunity in Ireland. So they had opportunities in Dubai. And out of that, I was visiting them for a number of years between kind of 2010 and 2014. And really from the first moment that I saw the city coming in on the plane, swerving in over kind of the Persian Gulf and then in over the desert, and you curl around and there's just this skyscrapers. Like in Ireland, buildings are 2 stories high. It's a very low-lying country. So to land in this country where there's buildings, we were like 70, 80 stories high, this glass and steel in the desert, just plonked. It's so surreal. It feels almost like a computer game, or you've gone into the future 50 years. You know, I was like, where are the flying cars? Where, you know, that's how it feels. So I knew from then, I was like, I want to capture this some way, or the spirit of the place, because it was a very, as much as I describe some of its flaws, or, you know, things that, you know, maybe could be addressed, it's a very optimistic place. People go there with dreams, and often those dreams do come true. You know, they make something of their lives. And while sort of contrast of that, I was coming from Ireland, which was so down on its luck. So I probably was 5 or 6 visits in a couple of years, and I still hadn't figured out my story. I knew I wanted to really write a portrait of a city. The Irish writer Colin McCann had written a book on New York a few years earlier called Let the Great World Spin, which it's one of my all-time favorite books. And it kind of captured the spirit of New York in the 70s with its disco and Studio 54 and, you know, this kind of lively art scene with Halston and sort of pop art. but at the same time, the violence in the city at the time was really dangerous. I just loved the energy of how he'd done it, which was using a series of viewpoints scattered throughout the city. So I knew I wanted to do something or try and do something similarly, and but I had no story, and that was the bit that I couldn't get right. And it wasn't until an idle thought came into my head. I think I was just sitting beside the pool one day, and I was like, Dubai is very like Victorian London, like as Victorian London was. And the reason for that was because in Victorian London, there was this sort of upper class of aristocracy who were hugely wealthy. And then there was like 90% of the people who were like not down the ladder a little bit. I mean, at the bottom of the ladder, you know, living awful lives, working in factories and sort of pandering to these super rich. And the other kind of connection I made between Victorian London and Dubai was the kind of complex relationship with morality. In Dubai, you had a veneer of sort of this respectability, but you know, at the same time, it was unsaid. There was, you know, sex workers, and you know, there was a whole undercurrent going on there as well, which was exactly the same as what happened in Victorian London. There was the respectable English family, and then there was a whole other world. And out of the click, it was like a series of steps that kind of rushed over me. I was like, well, the great Victorian kind of writer of London was Charles Dickens, and his novel A Mutual Friend came to mind. And in that novel, it opens up with a dead body being found in the Thames. That is the initiating event of the novel. And so my novel, I'd love to say, you know, it literally just drew from that. So my book opens up with a girl being found dead in Dubai Marina. And for me, that was I could probably write 80,000 words of nothing happening, but I don't think anyone would want to read it. So no, this gave me a plot on which the novel then kind of grew out of.
It's so interesting that you mention Victorian London. And I always almost feel like maybe in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the immigrant novel was westward, people moving to the West. You talked about a book that's set in New York. A lot of Indian immigrant novels tend to be about people moving westward. Right now, I think the way you've described Dubai from the eyes of some of these Irish immigrants is they are seeing like the big bright lights, big city version of a new culture, the way I feel like Asian immigrants or like immigrants from the eastern part of the world would have seen London or New York back in the 80s or 90s. And when we jump back to the idea of Victorian England, we're thinking of like, okay, the Industrial Revolution had just begun. There's like all these class differences, but there was also like a grand influx of people coming into the city of London itself. So I'm wondering, across these timelines, immigration and movement is such an important thing. We also see the one thing that I think all of these novels across all of these eras have in common is that when characters move into these cities, they come with aspirations, but quickly feel disillusioned in some way. And that kind of happens in your book as well. So I'm wondering how that arc happened in your novel.
Well, I suppose to start with, Ireland is quite unique in terms of Western countries where we have immigrants leaving Ireland dating back 200 years. You know, America, Ellis Island, going to America, you know, Ireland had a famine in the 19th century and millions left for the US. And that immigration has continued right up until the mid-90s. Most immigration in Ireland was always people leaving. And and then it kind of stopped because we had sort of 15, 20 years of economic boom where people were sort of coming to Ireland. And then suddenly the crash happened and the switch went back the other way to what happened. And actually in the book, one of the main characters is Trevor, who's a young man who's a personal trainer and he's thinking he'll go to Dubai. And, you know, once he's a personal trainer in Dubai, there's plenty of jobs. And in the book, we find out he has an uncle who is an alcoholic, and Trevor is quite dismissive of him. But for me, I put in Uncle Steve-O specifically because he is someone who in the 80s could have left for the UK and, you know, worked on the building sites at the time, but didn't. And his life went nowhere. And Trevor is going to Dubai and concerned that if he doesn't make the leap and go there, he'll end up like his uncle, you know, 20 years down the road. But I think it's funny because I have talked to interviewers in the UK, and I found our Irish audiences immediately understand the idea of an immigrant leaving, But when I talked to the English audiences, it was kind of a surprise when I discovered actually they don't have that, because we're neighbors, so I assume we have very similar worldviews, but actually it was quite different. And it's funny that actually being here, I found people I meet get it way more, and they get because people think of immigration in general terms, but for me, it meant that all of the people who were dearest to my life left, and the emotional cost of that is really, really high. And I think, you're only seeing friends who you'd have seen weekly every year, but when as I said, I talk to English audiences, it's not a narrative they're used to going back centuries. But thankfully being here, I seem to
Although maybe
meet kindred-
post-Brexit, we'll see a little more
we'll
of
see,
that.
maybe, yeah. No, so I just think it's every generation of Irish writer, and maybe here, there's always these stories of immigration. We had, even Colm Tóibín or Mary Costello have written novels about the Irish immigrating to the US. Brooklyn, I don't know, many of you know the book Brooklyn, which is very big, and Academy Street. So this is just a new take on something that's a long tradition in Ireland, in Irish literature.
So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the book. I'm trying not to give too much away, but the book is structured in an incredibly fascinating way. We have 7 main characters, and we see them through the course of 21 chapters. So each character basically gets 3 chapters,
Yes.
and each character has like an individual arc. And one of the things I loved about the novel is that you could almost read each individual arc like as if it was a story of its own. And when I said this to Jamie, I also said, I almost felt like this is a short story writer bringing his skill to the art of the novel. And that's exactly how I feel. I feel like I could read each of these stories individually, but like the sum is so much more than, like the whole is so much more than the sum of all its parts. So I'm interested in how you came upon this structure and what it has meant to you in the development of the plot.
Well, guilty. I have a background in short stories, so I have to say that the idea of a novel staying with one character for 80,000 words was daunting, definitely, and the idea of reading like the Colin McCann book and going, okay, there is another way to do this, and there's another way to do this that actually is very successful to, as I said, which my intention was to capture the spirit of a city. And honestly, I think a novel which is kind of structured like this just takes time before you even begin, and I'm very glad that I had the time of a couple of years to just really start thinking about characters and ideas, because there's definitely points in the novel where 7 people are kind of doing things at once, because it's all over a week. It's 7 days, the novel, it starts on a Friday and ends the following Friday. So at times there was a lot of things happening, and a lot of, I don't know, the novel Middlemarch, obviously. I'm like, how on earth did she keep like a whole town in her head doing things at the same time? And quite often, and even anything I've been working on a new novel since, I know the crisis of the book, I know or the crisis of the story, of the short story, and I maybe know 2 or 3 chapters ahead. But for me, it's like a ship that's on, and the North Star, and you just keep tacking the boat back in. And writing fiction is a weird mix of doing and allowing a little bit. You can overdo it and then rush and maybe not give the idea time to germinate, and you end up with a failed novel, and I have a drawer full of them. Or you can do too much allowing, especially with a novel, and then it just meanders and goes all over the place. So you have to kind of find your middle ground of the process that works for you. And for me, it's almost knowing how it feels and going, this is starting to feel like I'm pushing rather than feeling inspired. And then just some days where you're like, I've got to put the bum on a seat and get some words down and come what may. But the good thing I've kind of realized as well is that I always think on the hard days where the writing is really tough to come by, that the reader will see the blood on the page. And actually quite often it's no worse than the day where it flies out, So I'm always delighted when the agony I've had, hopefully hasn't translated.
So I'm also, like, as an editor, I tend to think of books and authors as, okay, this is a plot book and this is a character book. And to me, you're very much a character writer. And is that a conscious choice? Is that something that you decided to do?
I think part of the apprenticeship of being a writer, and I wanted to know since quite a young age, you know, you're kind of trying on styles. You write something, you go, oh, that's very like the last book I read. You know, I can see books that I wrote as a teenager. I tried a fantasy novel, and I'm like, you clearly read Lord of the Rings that year. It's just all Lord of the Rings. But kind of if you keep trying on all these shoes, that eventually you end up with a little bit from here and a little bit from there, and you end up with your own approach. And for me, I try to listen to the whispers, the kind of those little wisps of inspiration that come in, usually not at the desk, but when I'm maybe out walking, or very bored is a very good thing as well, like mowing the lawn or in a queue in the shop, and you'll just get a line or something will come in and it's an inspiration. And the first thing I do, thankfully with phones nowadays, is I write down, and I've made a conscious effort to write down every single creative idea I have, because I feel it honors the muse, you know, or I'm worried that if I don't do that, that one day they'll just say, well, you're not honoring, it'll go away. And then I write the idea down, and I know if it's an idea that's going to become more than that, because a few days later the next sentence will appear, and that could go on for a couple of months with a character. And then once I've kind of a messy few notes, I kind of put it into a Word document, and I'm starting to see, is there any patterns? Is there like a voice, like a note that I can hear? And there's questions that I'll tease out, and the big question for me is really to figure out the thing that would, you know, what is this character's biggest fear? What is the thing I can do to them that if it happens, they will unravel? And then my plot is doing it. I think you get, you know, the character of Siobhan in this book is sort of the desperate housewife. She's, you know, a rich woman living in Dubai. She's a very comfortable life. Her husband makes a load of money. She, you know, her concerns are, you know, the maid and, you know, the kids and things like that. And when the novel was finished, she felt the flattest of all of them, because I hadn't figured out her Achilles heel, that deep fear. And she was the one I had to kind of work hardest on. And when it clicked that if something happens to her kids, we're going to see a different person here. We're going to, you know, she's going to come alive. And so I really pushed that button on that. And what I then did was go through every scene she was in. And even if it wasn't a scene about the kids, just something that would needle that part of her personality to just squeeze a little bit more juice out of her shadow, I suppose, her shadow side. And that's always been my approach. Your character comes to you, starts hearing the voice and all that, and then you start thinking, okay, what are their fears? And another question that was given to me actually from my creative writing courses, my professor said, if this character was on their deathbed, is this the story? If they had one story to tell, would this be it? And if it's not that story, you're writing the wrong story for that character, because it should be that story.
I love that. That's such terrific advice.
So I'm definitely character-led. Plot for me comes out of character. I would worry that if I put the other way around, I'd be kind of fitting my characters into a box to do things I want them to do, and it wouldn't be authentic to the person they are. You know, you'd have a scene of dialogue going, now this character has to say this, so the plot continues on track. Yeah.
So you talked about some of this inspiration coming during like hours of boredom. And I love that. I feel like we don't give ourselves time to feel bored anymore. I know when I'm doing chores, I'm like, I should probably listen to a podcast just to be productive. And I think we don't often give ourselves time to get bored. I'd love to dig in a little bit into the act of creativity for you.
Okay.
Where does that come from, partly? And we also talked about like pulling out the fears of your character. What is the worst thing that can happen to this person, and making that happen? How much of that is like also from your own life?
I think you have to, if you want to get depth out of your characters, you're going to have to draw on something from yourself. I mean, even if someone writes a book that's sci-fi and set in the future, the emotional lives of those characters are going to be based on the author's emotional experiences, or the experiences of those around them, that they've kind of understood how the human experience works. In a way, people kind of go, who are you in the book? Which of the characters is most like you? And I'm like, they're all me. Every single one of them. I'm mad, clearly. You know, so the different parts of my, you know, you've Trevor in the book who is a real ladies' man, and I'm not a ladies' man. And then you have Tahir, who's a gay Emirati who's living in Dublin who has to return to Dubai because of this death that's happened. And I suppose his story is probably the most autobiographical in a sense. I know, like I grew up gay, but I grew up, as a Jehovah's Witness, which is quite a very conservative form of Christianity, very conservative. And when I lived actually in Dublin, I met gay men from the Middle East who obviously come from a Muslim background. And of course there's cultural differences, but there's an overriding thing there, which is you've come from a world, a family who have told you that being a certain way is bad. It's not even wrong. It's immoral, and you are the way you are. And there's this tension that then forms through childhood where you can never quite be the person your parents want you to be. And I know myself, it definitely internalized. There's a lot of not feeling good enough, a kind of a deep feeling of self-hatred, really, actually, which I kind of had to examine later on in life. And Asim's character is kind of drawn from that. I suppose he, having known, as I said, not men actually from Emirati men, but men from Kuwait and other places in the Middle East, I could just see we were talking a similar language, a similar kind of, I suppose, emotional pain. So when it came to writing his character, I felt I could draw on my own experience there. And because he's also very, like in many ways, he's a lot of emotional issues. And he's I always say, like, if you ever want to like really go mad, live a double life. It will literally turn you into a not, like, it'll drive you nuts. And I kind of think, I know myself when I first moved out of home, and I had my family and they were all, as I said, very conservative Christians. And then I went to college, and it was obviously a much more liberal environment. And you're kind of dipping in and out of two opposing worlds. And what used to happen to me was the narrative, like the words in your head just get louder, and you're kind of, the clash that exists in the real world is going on in your head as an endless rambling of chatter to the point where you start feeling insane. And I definitely feel Asim has that. I drew that from myself when writing him.
And both in your life, which you've just described, as well as in this character's life, there's like a very strong tension between sexuality and religion. And I'm actually wondering, do you ever think these two things can coexist peaceably?
It's funny, in the world, we hear the word tolerance, and we've somehow got confused what that word means. That tolerance means you have to celebrate your neighbor. Like, I don't tolerate eating dessert. I tolerate things I don't necessarily approve of or like, or food. You know what I mean? I wouldn't tolerate eating dessert. So it's not a case of you have to suddenly agree with everyone around you. We live in a democracy. That's the point, is people get to make their own choices. You just have to accept the fact that the people around you are autonomous beings and get to make their own choices. And it's so I think the term tolerance needs to be remembered. It's not a case of you have to go out and walk in gay pride marches. You just have to accept that this is a person and their choices, and as long as they're not impinging on other people's rights or hurting people, then we just have to be tolerant. And I think that's as much as is needed.
So I think maybe now is a good time for you to do a quick reading from the book to give everyone a sampler.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Like a big concern for me, actually, just generally, and I think it's a big thing for me in the book, is just economic inequality. I just find it so upsetting. I hate seeing people who have talent not being given opportunities, and and Dubai really is that world of have and have-nots. And in the book, and I've been to one of these brunches, so I don't know if people here have been to Dubai and been to the Dubai brunches. So if you are one of the lucky people who's the haves in Dubai, every Friday they have what these five-star hotels have, a Dubai brunch, which can only be described as a Roman feast of the most gluttonous, excessive order you can possibly imagine. So you go to the hotel, you pay to go in. It's quite expensive. You're taken to a sort of beautiful dining room, and essentially you're just served either prosecco or champagne all day, depending on the day. And what they have is these kitchens surrounding the room. You'll go into the first room, and it'll be like the English dinner kitchen, and it'll be beef and chicken and lamb and every kind of meat, and roast potatoes and potatoes gratin and glazed carrots and every vegetable and Yorkshire pudding. And that's just one kitchen. And then you go to the next kitchen and you'll have like the Indian kitchen and it'll have every kind of Indian food you can imagine. And then you go to the next kitchen and it's the Italian kitchen and every kind of food you can have. And then you go to the next kitchen and it's the cheese kitchen and they have every kind of cheese. I come from rural Ireland and they have cheeses that are made in like cottages off the west of Ireland. It's crazy. And then you go to the next one, it'll be the bread kitchen and all the world's different type of breads. And then you go to the next one, it's the seafood kitchen and it's lobster and oysters and shrimp and everything you can think of. And you just stay there for 5 or 6 hours from lunchtime to early evening and are just at your table laughing and drinking and going back up and down for food all day and drinking your champagne. That chapter in the book is exactly beside Tahir's story, the taxi driver who is just driving up and down a road all day, working 12-hour shifts, very bored. He's an active mind and he's climbing, and he's not, that's the other side of it. So they're kind of deliberately sandwiched together. I wanted kind of the grotesqueness. So I'm just going to read 2 paragraphs from this, which is Trevor, as I said, who's the brother who's visiting Dubai on a holiday. And he is trying to choose a dessert with his nephew. So Rocco is his nephew who's been living in Dubai his whole life. He's only about 9. Three fountains, dark milk and white chocolate, marshmallows, cut strawberries with blueberries and pineapple, biscuits and mini muffins all ready to be dipped. Trevor lifts Rocco as he inches the marshmallow under the flowing chocolate, his hands and mouth covered in the brown sauce. Behind the fountains, Trevor gazes at the rows of mini cakes, 10, 20, 30, easily 50 varieties. Half of these names he couldn't even pronounce. Morsels of flaked chocolate, glazed summer fruits, lemon, strawberry, and chocolate mousses, blackberry tartlets with vanilla-flavored mascarpone cream, flaky and shortbread pastries, fruit tarts, salted caramel croquembouche brioche, fresh fruit flutes, eclairs, perfectly round macaroons in a rainbow of colors, gold leaf chocolate cakes, gianduja-filled profiteroles with double chocolate sauce and toasted hazelnuts, a crepe stand, chocolate syrup, banana nut sprinkles, marshmallow, honey, summer fruit. Beside it, an ice cream stand, mint, mocha, praline, divine vanilla, choco orange, pistachio, rum and raisin. Trevor's plate remains empty as he looks, unable to move. Where to start? Other diners seem to be having the same trouble. What will I choose, darling? That looks delicious. Oh, I'm such a pig. Rocco has no problem picking ice cream flavors and crepe toppings. Maybe that's the secret. To be comfortable in Dubai, you have to be born there.
I hope you guys aren't too hungry after hearing that, because I think Jamie, I think there's another aspect to Jamie that I would love to share with all of you, which is that Jamie has also worked in publishing and he teaches creative writing. So I would love to impose upon your expertise on both the subjects of publishing and writing and ask you, what is it like having seen the inside of what it is like to be in a publishing house? I think a lot of people tend to romanticize the work that we do, which is that, we're probably like sitting in cafes reading masterpieces all day long, when actually we're probably looking at an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of numbers on it, right? Once you've seen it from the inside, how do you then approach it from the outside as a writer?
It's been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I've realized how, as a writer years ago, before I understood publishing, Rejection was so personal. It felt deeply personal. And then now having sat in publishing meetings for many years, and you're discussing work that's coming in, I've started to realize the question of the quality of the work is absolutely there and is paramount. And if the quality isn't there, the book won't happen. However, there is the wider discussion of the sales team, the publicity teams, the rights teams. And really, if a book is rejected by a publisher, it's them saying, we can't make it work within our framework of what we publish. So I now don't see Rejection as the same. My book is terrible. I sometimes get rejection and be like, I'm going to start a fire and throw my manuscript into it. Whereas I think now I'm a bit more, it's not. Like, publishing is where art and business collide. And sometimes great books really struggle to find a home because, and I call them the spreadsheet men, get a hold of it. And I hate the spreadsheet men because I just wish every bit of publishing was as romantically chosen, But I mean, even, you and I beforehand were talking about Shuggie Bain, the Booker Prize winning book, which was rejected 35 times by publishers. It was, and that will tell you then it went on to become a bestseller and obviously, won probably one of the most prestigious prizes in the world. So it's that tension of art and business is very tough, and it can be very, for a writer, I definitely think that can be deeply stressful. My advice definitely is to try and get an agent who can manage what you're doing. And I do think, if I was to give advice to anyone here who's maybe an emerging writer, be smart about looking for an agent. You've put years of your life into a book. Don't just send stuff out in an afternoon. It's like what I advise people to do beyond get your writing the best it can be, which is number one on the list. But once that is the case, you're like, right, this is ready to go. I encourage my students actually to go, who do you follow? It's not saying like, I am Margaret Atwood or I am, J.K. Rowling. But what you're kind of saying, I'm interested in those writers. I think the preoccupations I have are like those writers. I want to write in the genre of those writers, and pick 6 names who you feel are like that. And Google, so easy nowadays, who are their literary agents? And I encourage my students to contact that literary agent directly and say, dear, and have their name. That will put you ahead of 90% of the pile. You represent such and such a person whose work I greatly admire. I'm trying to write something in there, that I think is like their style or something like that. And I think you might be interested in having a read, or I'd like you to, would you be interested in having a read? That is so, an agent will appreciate that kind of thoughtfulness, or an editor, rather than, like, I worked in a publishing house in Ireland and we've never published poetry, ever. And we used to get poetry submissions all the time. And this is back when we were posting them in. So it's like the cost of a stamp, the cost of printing the document, and the effort that went into it. And even if that poetry manuscript came in and it was Seamus Heaney, it's the wrong place for it. So my advice is, when you're an artist, be an artist. But when the manuscript is done, be a business person and start thinking very, very carefully, as if this was a CV going in for a job. You wouldn't be someone who studied English and applying for a job in, a lawyer's, in a lawyer's firm. So the same applies here. Be very, very clear on that. And I do think the way to do that well is to actually figure out who your comps are, those authors who you think follow on from.
We just also talked about rejection, which is basically publishing's way of saying it's not you, it's me. And I swear, most of the time, that's what it is. How do you suggest that writers pick themselves up and carry on after rejection?
So I'm going to divide it into maybe short stories, and then I'll talk about the novels. So with short stories, I've kind of realized if you're sending in about 10 submissions, or maybe 8 to 10 submissions, and you're getting 1 good response, you're a champion. You are, as an emerging writer, you are actually hitting a home run. That is a really good result. Like, I think 1 in 8 is a really good result on that. So don't be discouraged by that. You're doing well. If you're not getting that, then maybe it's time to go back to the work itself and consider what you're doing. The reason being is there's a writer in Ireland called Billy O'Callaghan, who's a short story writer and one of Ireland's most successful short story writers, and he's published by Vintage, actually at Penguin in the UK. And I saw in an interview, he said he sends in 120 submissions a year for his short stories. Now, I am not doing that. And I was like, maybe that's what I'm doing wrong. Like, I'm only sending what? Probably 20 on a good year. So I'm not going, well, that's how he's managed to build up a reputation. He submits internationally. So that's something to think about. Are you submitting enough? Because even in a competition, if you're talking 1,000 entries, you get down to like the final 40 entries, they're probably all really good stories. So, good people are not going to win that, every competition. So it really can be a bit of a numbers game. But I mean, that's all on the proviso you've done your best work and you've edited your work thoroughly and you've really put it in. I think in terms of a novel, I recommend people to submit to 6 at a time, because normally nowadays, I don't know how you feel, you may contradict me immediately, but the idea of multiple submissions isn't the taboo it maybe would have been 20 or 30 years ago. I think 6 is a nice number, because if you send into 6 and you hear nothing, like it's real, like, what's it called, like in the Western movies, the the grass blows through the through the road, you can go back to your manuscript and go, maybe I need to do something here. There's something up, and it gives you another, whereas if you submit to 20 or 30, you've used up all your chances in one go, and you don't have anywhere to revise and resend. So do them in groups of 6, give them 3 months, and even one of the 6 coming back to you saying, I'm not accepting your manuscript, or I'm not going to represent you, but this is quite good. Just a one little line of optimism, good. The ball is rolling. Get back to that person, say, thank you so much. Can I send you future work? And they'll say yes. They absolutely will. So
I love how specific your advice is, can I just say, because it's not just follow your dream, it's actually like very specific 6 submissions. This is how you follow up. So on that note, I'm also interested in, I think there's also an unhappy side to submission. And there might be a point for every writer when they're like, actually, I'm kind of done with this. Is that a dangerous direction for a writer to go in, or do you think that that's also okay?
For me, I think it's Ted Hughes had this word for it, this curious impulse. And for me, the curious impulse keeps just, even when I've had enough of it, and I don't think the rejection ever stops. And I think that's one thing I've realized since being published over the, with short stories. And then you will never not be in a position where you're looking for approval from somebody at any point in your writing career. At the beginning, you're looking for approval from a wide variety of agents. Then once you're going to be published, you need your agent's approval, then they say yes, then it goes to your editor's approval, and they have to say yes, and then it goes to the publishing team, and then they have to say yes, and then your book is published, and you have the reviewer's approval, and then you have your audience approval, and then you have the awards approval. And do you know what happens then? You start again. Your agent's approval, your editor's approval. You will never get off the wheel of, it's like there must be a Buddhist teaching in there somewhere of like the wheel of sorrow or something. So I've kind of realized, and I've had to learn, is do I enjoy putting my bum on a seat and putting words on a page? Because that's the only bit of it, if that has to be at the heart of it. If you don't enjoy just the physical act of it, it is wonderful to be here, and I am thrilled, and thank you so much to the festival. This is the lovely bit. This is the bit where you feel, oh, it's amazing. I'm just so delighted, and thank you everyone here today. I feel really blessed. But it's still the icing. There's a cake, and it is sitting in front of a computer, and if you enjoy just that curious impulse and investigating that and working with it, and if you wake up one day and you don't have that feeling, it's a very tough road. And I do think maybe you have reached a writer's block. And it was funny, I was listening to a podcast with Elizabeth Bishop, she's a poem, Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Big Magic. And she was talking about, if it starts to feel like push, just say you'll take a month off. If it's for you, you'll come back. Every time I've done something like that, I'm like, oh, but then I may never come back to it. I always do. It's an addiction. You'll come back, but just give yourself that space, and that allowing, I think, just that breathing and just will do your creativity the world of good.
And do you love it?
I love it. I love it. But I will say the question you've asked there, I found, obviously the rush of the book coming out is amazing, but I've definitely found COVID has put such a heaviness around me. And with what's happened in Ukraine in recent weeks, I could feel that I haven't written really much in the last 6 weeks. I've just felt so heavy. And my agent said to me, just don't write till after you've been to Jaipur. He said, you'll come back, you'll be full of energy, and you're ready to go again. And I can feel it. It's done that. It's brought back that energy. So sometimes maybe it's time to just not hold so tightly and just take a deep breath.
Yeah. Any specific advice for the writing process itself, or the editing process once you're done with the writing process?
Sometimes I think we all have an impulse to laziness. It's just there in us. If we can do a shortcut, we will. And we hate concentrating. I've realized human beings just hate concentration. We like to just be fed information very easily. So when I'm editing and I'm really sharp at the start, and then like an hour in, I can just feel I'm starting to get a bit weary. And I'll come across something and I'll have a feeling more than, it might not even be a thought, of like something isn't working here. And my lazy part of my brain goes, that'll do. It'll be fine. Death of good writing. It's the death of good writing. So get really, really aware of when you're okay with something not being perfect. And when you reach that moment, go for a walk, get a coffee, maybe leave it for the day, because that'll do is the death of good writing. It really is. You know, no amazing writer I've ever met, I'm not talking for myself, I'm talking like the major writers around the world, they are so finicky about their work, and they will push their concentration to make the book sparkle like a piece of glass. I think editing is like taking the dirt off a window, you know, and you're waiting for the light to shine through, and they want every speck of dirt off that glass. The light comes through that window as much as it can. And I have one little silly tip, which might be of helpy. This is definitely for short story competitions. I mean, for a novel, it's quite a task to do for yourself, and you will have editors to do it if you're lucky. But if you are submitting a short story to a competition, my final edit to do is to get every typo out of it is to read the story backwards. And by that, I don't mean backwards by word, as in pearls for diving. I mean, go to the end of the story, go to the last sentence and read it out loud. I'll just find some random sentence here. And the little boy is wiggling around in his seat. And then go to the sentence before, to hear glances in the mirror. The reason being is when you edit forwards, you start getting sucked into your own story, you find your own story so interesting, and then you stop seeing the individual words again, and that's where you end up missing out like an and, or a the, or a comma. But by reading it backwards, there is no story to get absorbed in, and you stay with the physical words that are on the page. And I think, especially if you're submitting to a short story competition, where the competition on those final 20, 40 stories is so fierce, why handicap yourself with a few typos? I mean, imagine you lost out on a major prize because you missed, there was a few typos in it, and they had to make a decision between two brilliant stories, but yours the one with the typos. So, you know.
I love that tip, and I'm stealing that. Okay, one last question,
Okay.
a quick one before we jump to audience questions. Give us an Irish writer recommendation and an Indian writer recommendation.
Well, I'm going to make sure I pronounce it. So I'm actually reading Tell Me How to Be at the moment, which actually I think is your book?
Yeah.
I think, yeah, so I've actually been reading that. I've been spotting up on who was going to be interviewing me today. So I'm actually really enjoying that. And I suppose it's a book that relates so closely to, because it's about a young Indian man who's gay, and he's deeply worried about coming out to his mother. But what is great about the story, I haven't finished it yet, is children don't see their parents as people. They see them as mom and dad or grandma and granddad. And you kind of realize that Renu, is it Renu?
Yeah,
Is his mother has a whole other life going on, and she's not as naive or, you know, it's funny sometimes when I have my book there, The Diving for Pearls, and it's never an old lady in the audience who is shocked, ever. They've seen it all. You know, sometimes someone's going to be, I read your book, and I'm like, oh goodness, thinking, you know, I hope I haven't shocked them. And it's never that person, you know, and I think it's quite funny to see how he perceives his mother versus the woman she actually is.
And an Irish writer.
Irish writer. My favorite Irish novel of all time is Amongst Women by John McGahern. It is, I love the sentence, and I love an author who labors on the sentence and stays with it until it is exactly what they mean to say. It's so clear, there isn't a word too many, and I find that to be exquisite. And it's like that piece of glass that just is polished within an inch of its life. Sometimes when I'm reading, I can almost feel the glassiness in my teeth. It's like, it's so, I just want to, it's like seeing the Mona Lisa or something. You know, it's just that good. And John McGahern for me, and I'd say if you ask most Irish writers, he would be in everyone's top 5.
Okay, I think it's time for questions from the audience. I see a number of hands up. So is there a mic going around? The gentleman over there.
Jamie, Manasi, thank you so much. Fascinating discussion. And the sort of question that pops up to my mind immediately is having 7 protagonists, each of them having 3 chapters, right? And they all have to be distinct. Perhaps in your mind, that's easier. But for an audience to be able to grasp that, it's so much more difficult. So when you're thinking that, right, or when you're developing that, when you're polishing that glass, what sort of strategies do you use? And Manasi, as an editor, when you're looking at something like that, what sort of lens do you bring to that thought? Thank you.
I actually was given a really simple tip for one of my creative writing tutors back in the day, and that was if you're going to write like a polyphonic novel with a series of voices, make sure they're not all sisters of the same age from the same house, 5 sisters, all, unless you're like Jane Austen or, it could be quite hard to make them distinct because they're very similar profile of maybe look and education and all that. So there was a definite sense, and this is probably because I know there's a huge debate around whether you should teach creative writing or whether it should be kind of inert. This was just a little tip my professor said was don't make your life hard from the beginning by having the characters, too many of them around the same age, and and because that definitely helps divide them out. I think in terms of then you do then have to find their voice, which for me, I'm trying to think how I do that. Each of them actually were kind of developed quite differently. I mean, the characters who are further away from my direct experience, when I was in Dubai, I was chatting to people there on the ground, the taxi drivers, I was keen to know. And I think what was good about that is I kind of realized my own ignorance because, the maid in one of the houses who I was chatting to, she's sending money home to her kids to go to university. It's not, I think sometimes it could be too easy to kind of forget. And another girl I talked to, like she's building a house back home. And she's providing for her family. She's actually this person who, in the worst sense of the word, you might just go about your day and not say hello to or talk to, actually is like empowered. Like she's going, I'm getting my life together. I'm going to be here 5 years. I'm going to get my house at home. My kids will have a great education. And I mean, it's a huge sacrifice to be away from their children, but it's not, it was good for me actually, and I'll admit my ignorance, until I spoke to this person, I was like, this person is on a mission. They're not, the poor, but they, and I thought that was good personally to engage with that more. And I definitely tried to do that when I was thinking of the Gita, the Ethiopian maid. She has planned, she's going to open up a business back home, and and that was very important rather than, I really, you just really don't want to, you want to remember that these are people, they're not tropes, they are people with dreams and aspirations, and we all have a world inside our own heads, there's 7 billion worlds on this planet. And I hope with the 7 worlds I've created, they feel like worlds.
I think you have.
Okay.
And to quickly answer your question, as an editor, I mean, just to cut a long story short, the only question that really matters is, do I want to keep turning the page? And if I want to keep turning the page, then there's probably something there. I am going to keep this very short because we have about 2.5 minutes, and I think we can take maybe one more question. Let's take somebody from this side. There's a lady over there.
Hello. First of all, amazing session. Why did you choose the number 7 specifically? Like, is there a historical significance or reason behind it?
Oh, the number 7? I love the number 3 and 7, and I think it's probably just absorbed into it's so, relevant to storytelling, and I don't know if it was that conscious really actually, but no, I don't know if it's that conscious, but it's I'd have to say it's probably just something from reading mythology, and that is just soaked into my storytelling there, but it wasn't conscious.
Thank you.
Okay, we may have time for one more. The gentleman in the second row here.
Amazing session, Jamie. So you touched upon economic disparity and how people from different economic backgrounds may get unequal opportunities. And I could kind of relate to that. Like I wanted to study sort of English, but I still write. But I often wonder, would I have done something better if I could get the sort of apt education for it? So what tip do you have for people like me?
I'm really struggling.
Sorry, could you just very quickly repeat the question?
You touched upon economic disparity and how
Economic disparity.
people from different economic backgrounds can get unequal opportunities or how there are better opportunities for people from for a sort of better economic background. And
I'm really struggling to hear you.
I think maybe there's something wrong with the mic because I think there's a little bit of feedback here.
I was sort of touching upon the economic disparities. There is a difference in economic background and how things are different relating to education and sort of
Okay.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
Yeah,
catch
okay.
up, yeah.
Maybe, maybe you can just find Jamie afterwards. I think he's going to be signing books, so I hope you've all got your copies ready.
Thank you. Actually,
And-
before I have 12 seconds before we go, can I just thank the Irish Embassy and Ambassador Ward for and Culture Ireland and the festival for everything. This has been an amazing trip and to meet new audiences and writers. So thank you.
And thank you.
For this beautiful session. And we thank Culture Ireland and Embassy of Ireland for their support. Thank you.